KPPP-LP Fargo-Moorhead 88.1 FM. Hi everyone, this is another episode for the Lady Coddington Queer Analysis mini-series, I suppose. You know, in between all the hashtag free VLDS8 reporting and working stuff that I'm doing. So I'm going to get back to that while I await more information on that. The petition on that is currently at 26,000 signatures. Hopefully we gain more. And, you know, stuff like this, even for fan-made movements, are, you know, they take years to do. And so I hope that despite the frustration, people can stick to it. So I'm going to continue with some other things, another announcement. January 29th this month is my birthday, so if you'd like, you can donate for my birthday. Made a tiny URL where you can go to tinyurl.com/Nemo26bday. That is tinyurl.com/Nemo26bday. So you can go to that donation thing on Facebook where it's hosted and donate for my birthday. If you want to help me, you know, get other stuff that, you know, is on Amazon or whatever I need for equipment, you can also, you know, that will help fund that. Or you can just for fun, you can hit me up on PayPal. So, you know, paypal.me/anemonefish, or just drop a Ko-fi, which is, there's a button for it on the Finding Me blogspot there. So, not the blogspot, but the WordPress. So, you know, you can find that at ko-fi/Cicados Scribble, SIQUEIROSCRIBBL. So you'll see all these links right now, and also on the video. But when you get to the PayPal, don't mind my dead name, you know, of course. And let's see, what else do I got? Nothing else. All right. So last episode of this book analysis, I left off after the July 15th, 1902 journal entry. And then I wanted to get to the next part. So the July 16th entry, the day after she has returned from the potting shed, she's going to talk about how she tries to go back to it to find it again, and then she's not going to be able to find it, and it'll be very sad. So she will have to try her best to remember the spell that she saw. And so I will now cut to that right now.
July 16th, 1902. This morning, as soon as ever, I had finished my lessons. I ran down to the potting shed, but there was a mystery. I cannot find the little window through which I climbed only yesterday. It was quite vanished, as if it had never been. I almost cried, but I said to myself, come, this will never do. Sir Walter would never have sat down and cried. Then it suddenly occurred to me that I could remember the spell, clear as daylight. So I fetched my pressed fairy book in my chair and sat behind the shed and said the spell. I sat and waited, but nothing happened. Then I realized I was doing it all wrong. I had to do what the spell said. I had to sit where the cat sits and smell a rose and all that. The cat sits in the obriesha. So I got a rose, sat amongst the obriesha, and shut my eyes. Before you could say simpkins, spillikins, I heard tiny sounds like sugar cubes falling in a well, and tiny laughter, and music no louder than a mouse's breath. I opened my eyes, and there, all around me, on the grass and in the air, were the fairies. They had returned to me after all these years. This is the one I got this time. She is a funny little thing. I think her name must be Mothcatcher. She is a little lopsided creature. No doubt she casts spells on chickens and on the legs of dogs. It is she who turns biscuits soggy when you dip them in your cocoa, for only a second, and it is she who makes those mysterious holes that appear in your pinafore, when your governess had it darned only the other day. I think she looks rather nervous.
Now, I skipped an entry in the book because, it wasn't really important for this particular analysis, but the point is that the fairy call did work because, she already talked about Mog Cracker and performing the spell correctly. But in this August 22nd, 1902 entry, it becomes a bit of a panic because she loses her fairy book, and it just becomes so weirdly funny of how it becomes to be lost and later on when she's able to find it again. So
August 22nd, 1902. A terrible shock today. I found Auntie Mercy rummaging around behind the big steamer truck in the attic. That's where I hide this book. It's the only safe place in the house, because generally no one goes up there except Etty and me, and sometimes Cousin Nicholas. But he doesn't count, because he's a boy and doesn't believe in anything. My heart jumped into my mouth and felt so frightened I almost couldn't speak. But suddenly I heard myself saying, "Oh, Auntie Mercy, is there anything I can get for you? It is terribly dirty and dusty up here, and you are dressed in your Sunday petticoats and Father's old silk hat. You surely don't want to get them dirty, do you?" Auntie Mercy stopped and looked round at me. She had a big black smudges over her nose and cheeks. I almost laughed out loud in her face, which is a terribly rude thing to do, and you must never do it to Auntie Mercy. Well, Auntie Mercy turned and frowned and said, "Don't believe in fairies." I thought it was all up. Not that Auntie Mercy would stop me, of course, but she would be bound to tell my governess, and then goodness knows what evils would befall. "Oh, Auntie Mercy," I said, "you must never say that. Don't you know that every time you say that a fairy dies?" "Don't believe in fairies," she repeated. It was only then that I noticed she had a book in her hand. Oh my goodness, my pressed fairy book! "Would you like me to read to you?" I asked, holding out my hand for the book. But Auntie Mercy had run to the little window in the attic, and she suddenly opened it, and before I could stop her, she had thrown my book out so that I fell right into the drive where the servants were preparing the carriage for my parents. Now all was indeed lost. I ran down to the stairs, hoping against hope that I would reach my precious book before any of the servants had a chance to notice it. But when I arrived at the front door, Barker already had the book in his hands and was looking through its pages. As soon as he saw me, he hid it behind his back. "What is it you have there, Barker?" I said, trying not to sound too anxious. "It's nothing, miss," he replied, looking rather ruffled. "Oh, but I think it is, Barker," I said, "and I think it belongs to me." "Indeed, I'm sure it doesn't, miss," he said, but I was firm with him. Barker gave me a strange look. I thought, he knows my secret, he hates me. And I quite thought he was going to take my book then and there and show my governess. And he didn't. In fact, the strangest thing happened. I stamped my foot and said, "Barker, I really do insist that you give me that book at once, or I shall be forced to complain about your behavior to Fielding." At this point, Barker turned bright red. "Indeed, miss, I am sure this book is—" "Give it to me, Barker." Then, very reluctantly, he handed me the book. But what were my feelings when I realized that indeed it was not my book? It was a book I had never seen before. However, I pretended that it was the book I thought it was, and I took it and thanked Barker and told her that it was a very special book to me. I fled indoors and back to my own room. Dear Diary, imagine my horror when I sat on my bed and opened the book and discovered, well, I can hardly write down what it was. It was called 1001 Arabian Nights. It apparently consisted of many stories, but they were illustrated with a series of pictures which I cannot describe to you. Suffice it to say that they showed ladies and gentlemen doing well. I have no words for it. Things. I blushed as I turned the pages and felt quite sick. This was the book I had claimed to Barker was mine. How would I ever be able to look at that man in the eye again? I burst into tears on my bed, and I cried with shame and vexation. I ran back to the attic and searched for my book of pressed fairies, but then came the worst thing of all. It had vanished.
So on this August 22nd entry, during this time as an adult, I started understanding something interesting about Angelica Coddington as a queer person. And I'd like to think that she was queer to an extent because, whether it was asexual or aromantic, you can pay attention to this story and you might come to this conclusion as well. So in her reaction to these sexual scenes in the 1001 Arabian Nights comes with the disgust, the shock, rather than surprise. Well, I mean, there is some surprise because it was not her book, but the curiosity that comes with being a young teenager of what you're looking at, and the continued theme throughout the book as you continue reading of her sex repulse attitude. So, and I thought that was interesting, growing up, and I couldn't put my finger on it until I grew older and realized, oh, okay, so she reads to me more as a aromantic, asexual person that is sex repulsed, and her only interest is smashing these fairies in her book. So, let's continue.
August 23rd, 1902. I have disposed of that dreadful book. I have still not found my pressed fairy book. And I wonder how did that other book come to be there? I wonder. It certainly hadn't been there before, and Auntie Mercy would certainly never have taken it there. It is a mystery. I got my ordinary flower pressing book and caught another fairy today. Probably just a goblin. 13th January 1903. Today is my 15th birthday. I am grown up at last. Mama and Papa invited me to have supper with them. It felt very strange. Mama gave me a toasting fork and a pair of white gloves. Governess gave me a copy of the Household Compendium, an invaluable guide to all householders, and so of little interest to me. Cousin Nicholas gave me a photographic camera. As I was getting into bed, I noticed a small fairy sitting under the wardrobe. It was crying. I bent down and picked it up. It was so upset it hardly seemed to notice or care. I set it down on the washstand and examined it. One wing appeared to be broken. It had little marks on its dress, and its wand was bent. "What's the matter?" I asked, but it just went on sobbing its heart out. This was the first time I had ever spoken to a fairy, so I said, "What is your name?" It looked up at me for a moment, and then mumbled something like "Pipskin Tinkle," but I couldn't get another word out of it, so I got out my flower-pressing book, and I got it. 1st February 1903. A big argument with Cousin Nicholas about fairies. He said I was stupid to believe in such rubbish. I said that he would change his tune if I could prove to him that they exist. He said I couldn't. So I went up to the attic to find my flower-pressing book, but now I couldn't find that either. It had disappeared, just like my pressed fairy book. I searched the attic through and through, but it had just vanished. Cousin Nicholas kept laughing at me. He really is an opinionated young man. I said I could prove it to him, and that I would take a photograph of some fairies, and then that would prove it. So he said he would help me. But I told him it would be no use, that the fairies wouldn't come while he was there, but he insisted. So we sat behind the potting shed. I got another book, and sat very, very still. Presently I heard the little voices and giggling and laughing, but I could not see anything. Cousin Nicholas sat very still. He cannot hear anything, he said later. Then suddenly I saw one hovering just in front of my nose. "There!" I shouted, and Cousin Nicholas took a photograph as I cut the book shut. Unfortunately, the fairy got away. But there was nothing there, he said. Yes, there was, I replied. It was just you couldn't see it. I wonder if the camera saw it. 23rd February 1903. I have finally got the photograph developed, and I can hardly contain my excitement. There on the photograph is the fairy. Now I have proof. Nobody can call me stupid or foolish again, or accuse me of making up stories like my governess used to do. I can show the world that there really are fairies, even Cousin Nicholas, but unfortunately he is away at school again. 1st March 1903. The first person I showed the photograph to was Barker. This was a mistake. He just grinned and said I was a clever little pixie. The stupid dolt of a man. Why did I show it to him? Finally, I worked up my courage and showed it to my governess. She is a new one. She seemed very interested and wanted to know how I had done it. I said, "It is a photograph." "Yes," she replied, "but how did you make it look as if there is a fairy leaping out of your book?" I told her it was a real fairy, and she went very quiet, and I was later summoned to appear before my father. I was so nervous. It is a month or more since I last spoke to him. He had the photograph already when I approached him. He seemed quite calm, but when I repeated to him what it was, he grew very angry and told me I was a wicked girl for persisting in such untruths. Finally, he sent me to my room, and I was to stay there until I could distinguish fact from fiction. Oh, the injustice of it all! If only I could find my press fairy book, I could prove it to them, but it is still lost. 2nd March 1903. The most unfair fate. My father has taken the photograph of the fairy and locked it in his desk. He says I am not to have it back as long as I persist in my stories. He has also taken away my camera. What am I to do? I wrote to Cousin Nicholas. 8th March 1903. This morning I received a letter from Cousin Nicholas. He said I should steal the photograph from my father's study and send it to the newspaper. I wrote back that I should not do anything so vulgar. I fear Cousin Nicholas betrays a coarseness of mind. Perhaps it would be better to have less to do with him in the future.
Alright, so we get to the a little bit more information about Angelica, which is mentioned in this 13th January 1903 entry, and you find out that it's her 15th birthday, which puts her birth at January 13th, 1888. And since her birthday is now 15 in 1902. So, continuing on, she gets into the trials, or not the trials, but like the signs that she's become a woman with the gifts that she's given, and she's just kind of like, whatever. Can I go back and smash my fairies now? Cool. And so after that, she becomes like more determined to get evidence of fairies' existence. And so she has her argument with Cousin Nicholas to get evidence, and then he's like, all right, fine, let's take a picture. And, gets in a fight with him about how they go about it. But they do get the picture. So in this November 23rd, 1903 entry, you see more maturity of Angelica Coddington as she comes upon her first brush with death through going to Auntie Mercy's funeral. And so in that moment, she starts to realize that what she's doing to the fairies is probably killing them and or hurting them to an extent. So she, she's horrified at herself, like, was I just some sick F, Was I like F'd in the head to have done this, like, as a child? Like, what is wrong with me? How could I do this? And so it's just like really fascinating to see that, like, that mindset change where she has to think about, why am I doing this? Should I be doing this at all? And should I ever do it again? And so she makes a promise to herself, let's not do that again. And so she, puts it down, and you can like kind of hear in the words of like her mortification.
November 23rd, 1903. Today, Auntie Mercy died. We were all upstairs crying, and she died in her room about 3 o'clock. The doctor said it was very peaceful. It is a curious thing, but today I also found, at long last, my pressed fairy book. It was perfectly safe and not damaged in any way. But the most curious things was where I found it. It was behind the steamer trunk in the attic, where I had always kept it. And yet, I had looked there time and time again, and it had not been there. But the strangest thing was that there were several new fairies pressed in the book. Who had done it? Certainly not Auntie Mercy. I had told no one about it. I cannot understand it. Perhaps the fairies themselves did it? But why would they press their own kind? I opened these pages with trembling hands, and now I have a terrible confession to make. As I looked at the familiar faces of the fairies, I was suddenly overwhelmed with remorse. As I thought of these dear little creatures, and I imagined the end to which I had brought them, I suddenly felt a strong sensation of guilt sweep over me, and I went red as the hearthrug. How could I have done this? Surely I was the cause of much pain and anguish to these dear little things I loved so much. Why had it never occurred to me before? Was I just a heartless little girl with no feelings? My mind was thus in a state of such perturbation that I knew not how long I had been sitting there, when suddenly, to my astonishment, I saw a little figure hovering in the air, but a few inches from the book which lay open on my lap. "Toppity-doo," it said. "My name is Tuppence, and I have come to test you on your Latin irregular verbs." At this, it landed on the open pages of my book, and I don't know why, nor can I offer any defense for what I did, but it was as if the old habits were too strong. I simply could not help myself. The moment its little feet alighted on the page, I banged the book shut on it, and I heard the familiar little shriek and the slight squashing sound as I pressed the book shut harder and harder. Then it all went quiet. I looked around the room. Everything was perfectly normal. The clock was ticking on the shelf above the ottoman. My old nightgown was thrown across the back of the chair, just where I had been told not to leave it. The fire in the grate crackled and fizzed with new wood. And yet I felt like a murderess. I thought my hands were stained with blood. They looked red, and yet I knew that it was my fancy, for fairy blood is never red. For a moment I thought I could hear other fairies around me. Perhaps they will seek retribution. Perhaps they will try to get their own back on me. For the first time I felt afraid. I felt uncertain for this whole mysterious world into which I had such glimpses. And yet, if I could hear anything, it was tiny cheers. Impossible! I put the book down and backed away to the other side of the room, suddenly cold all over. I vowed I would never ever look into my pressed fairy book again.
There follows a gap of 3 years before the next entry. Editor.
December 3rd, 1906. It is 3 years since I caught my last fairy. I have finally worked up the courage to open my pressed fairy book. I opened it boldly at the last pressing. The fairy who said her name was Tuppence. Strangely, I no longer felt guilty nor afraid. And when I looked at this last pressed fairy, it seemed to me that there was something odd, but I cannot put my finger on it. Perhaps it did not look quite as afraid as the others. That familiar glint of horror and panic was missing from its eyes, but perhaps that is just my fancy again. At this moment a truly odd thing happened. I had hardly been looking at the book for a minute when I heard a rude noise just behind my right ear. I thought perhaps it was Cousin Nicholas playing tricks on me, and I turned around with a laugh to snap that book in his face. Imagine my surprise, then, when I found myself facing a nasty-looking little goblin who was standing on the back of my chair blowing raspberries and sticking his tongue out at me. But all I had was a glimpse of him, for I was too late to stop the book snapping shut, and he was gone. There was the usual squish, and I at once reopened the book. There was the rude little beast, half squashed on the page, but still sitting up and making nasty faces at me. "Yoo-hoo, fish face," it said, and then added an extremely impolite remark about my undergarments, which it would not be seemingly to repeat here. I therefore had little compunction in slamming the book shut on the beastly little creature, and pressing the pages down as hard as I possibly could. And I didn't stop, even though I could hear it squeaking and yelling. However, the next moment I was shrieking as well, for I could feel something grasping one of my fingers, and I realized that one of the creature's hands had not been caught in the book, and was now waggling around free. It gave my finger the most dreadful tweak, but I went on pressing with all my strength, and eventually I heard the squeaks grow fainter and the hand finally stopped waving about and went limp. I confess, I felt a little weak at the knees. But my ordeal was not over yet, for when I opened up the book to see what sort of impression I had obtained, I found the most gruesome and disgusting sight. I resolved never to press fairies ever again.
So, interestingly enough, I guess goblins are the exception since they're kind of rude. And she decides to break her promise, and then she's like creeped out again by the whole like ordeal of trying to press it. And then she is 19 years old when we get to the entry where she talks about her cousin Nicholas getting moody. And I'm like, oh God, so this is going to be a problem in the future. And at least when I was a teenager, I read it that way. So then, and of course he was already acting weird. And then we get to the most hilarious part where when she does get her photo finally published in the regular newspaper, as mentioned in the publisher's letter at the beginning or whatever, that she was like, oh crap, I did not want this to happen actually, and I take it back, and because otherwise I'm gonna look like a fool. And so she just decided, I'd rather be private about this. So then she's embarrassed and she's not going to meet with anybody. But now the interesting part is despite the fact that she was so embarrassed by this, the fairies seem to be very aware of what's going on with the humans. So they ask her to take their photograph instead of being pressed. And I'll talk about that wording later. And so, she does or tries to do that at least once in this entry before she, kills it. And then, it's just onwards from there with more pressing. And I guess we've just forgotten our first brush with death and our promises to not press fairies anymore. And it's not brought up again. So I suppose it's okay still. And she's, gotten over it.
4th December, 1906. Today, I caught 2 more goblins. They really are horrid little creatures, and I have absolutely no regrets about catching them. One of them made an awful mess of my dress, however, and I had to pretend to my new governess that I had spilled some paint on myself. I am sure it did it deliberately. Today was also remarkable another way. Cousin Nicholas arrived by the afternoon train. He came up to my room where I was working and gave me an envelope. In it was a photograph I had taken all those years ago. He would not tell me how he had obtained it, but begged for permission to publish it in the monthly journal for which he is now working. No matter how I resisted the idea, he found some way of countering my doubts, and I eventually gave my reluctant permission, save that my name be in no way connected to its publication. At this moment, Cousin Nicholas put his arm around my waist and kissed me in a way that quite astonished me. I asked him what he thought he meant by taking such liberties, whereupon he smiled and said, I had always been a bit of a cold fish, or some such nonsense. I began to wonder whether I had done right by allowing him to publish the old photograph. 5th December, 1906. Caught a beautiful specimen today. A large painted fairy that seemed to fly by so slowly it was almost asking to be pressed. I am glad I did not show my pressed fairy book to Nicholas. I do not understand him at the moment. He seems to be very moody. Perhaps I will show it to him one day. 7th December, 1906. Surrounded by fairies in church today, some of them very insolent and provoking. I cannot help snapping my prayer book at them. Can't one, but in future I shall bring my pressed fairy book to church with me. 5th January, 1907. Disaster! The regular came out today with my fairy photograph emblazoned on the first page, accompanied by a long article in which I am not only named as a photographer, but am hailed as an authority on fairy lore and cited as a believer in fairies, goblins, gnomes, elves, and pixies. I shall become a laughing stock. I shall never speak to Cousin Nicholas ever again. Caught such a strange creature today. I do not know what kind of fairy it could be. 7th January, 1907. A fairy called Fiddlefick flew in my window and sat on the end of my bed this morning. Would you like to take my photograph? It asked. so I set up my camera and prepared the plates. But the moment I took off the lens cap, the beastly little thing made rude gestures at me. I told it that it must be still, otherwise I cannot photograph it. So Findlefig sat still, and I got out my book, and the vain thing was so busy posing, it did not even notice me creeping up behind it. 12th January 1907. It is as I feared. The regular is full of letters today, making fun of the photograph, and of course, of me. It is so humiliating. There were 1 or 2 readers, however, who seemed to be impressed and wished to meet me. I shall have nothing to do with them, of course. Got 3 fairies and 2 goblins this afternoon. They have never been so easy to catch. I went. It was very exciting. 13th January 1907. Cousin Nicholas came this morning and proposed marriage to me. Did you ever hear of such a thing? I told him not to be so ridiculous. He seemed quite upset. I'm sure I don't know why. He knows how I feel about him. How could I ever tolerate someone who laughs at me behind my back? Besides, what do I want to have to do with men? They have hair in their ears. Several newspaper men were round the house this morning, pestering me. I shall have to go away. I cannot bear all this. My only consolation is my fairies. Got 4 today, a goblin, and what I think may be my very first pixie.
Okay, so what I find hilarious about this particular entry is that, okay, it's, let's see, 1902 when she was 15, and now it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's 5 years later where she's now 19 years old. And on the same day, Cousin Nicholas proposes to her. And I'm assuming they're like distant cousins. And this is like, you know, the old-fashioned marry in the family to keep the wealth and all that. And it's just so funny because she's just like, why did you have any idea that you could marry me? And then so for me, it's like, okay, you know what? Understandably, I wouldn't want to propose to someone of interest on their birthday because it just kind of takes away the attention from them. But also, like, you know, Nicholas, did you not read the signs? You are, you know, adult to her, like, whatever. So, haha. So, and then after that, the next entry is she's escaped to Italy. And I'm like, oh my God, this gal. You know, I'm glad for her freedom, but at what cost? So, I'm going to have the audiobook continue on, and we'll stop at the end before I get to the next part. I'm going to tell you now, before we continue to that next part, if we don't finish it in this particular program, that I'd like to put out a trigger warning for sexual assault content, because that's how I personally read it. And so if you're sensitive to that type of content, whether in reading or audio form or how it's portrayed, whatever, just a warning to going forward and understanding it. And if you're not bothered by it, then continue on.
1st May 1907. Napoli, Italy. I have escaped. It is beautiful. But even here I am surrounded by my fairy friends. This one came and hovered over my bed. I keep my book under the bedclothes and was able to surprise it. 2nd May 1907. Lord Crowley asked for my hand in marriage this morning. Such arrogance! We only met 2 months ago, and I scarcely think I have formed any attachment to him. Nor, indeed, do I imagine that he could believe that I had. And yet, there he was on his knees, trying to grasp my hand in his. The most terrible shudder of revulsion ran through my veins as I remembered that book so long ago, and I imagined the depictions within it of men and women caressing in the most lewd and abandoned manner. And then I thought of myself and this gross man in a similar contact. Oh, my blood runs cold just to think of it. Lord Crowley has more hair in his ears than anyone I know. My fairy collection grows every day, but I am not at all sure that these Italian fairies are quite proper. They seem to have a leering quality about them that I do not at all like. 10th May 1907. More Italian fairies. They seem to be showing off. I'm not sure I like them.
That's all the time we have for today, so thank you for listening. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Did you find yourself today while finding me? Feel free to send me a message. You can contact us at 701-566-0917, at Nemo Potatoes on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Contact me through my contact on kpppfm.com/finding-me on that tab, or email me at nemo@kpppfm.com. If you'd like a sneak peek to the building of Finding Me programs in the future, consider becoming a patron at my Patreon at patreon.com/anemonefish. Follow us on Facebook at 88.1 FM Fargo Moorhead, the People's Press Project, and Mexi-Can. Donations to Fargo Moorhead's newest low-power commercial-free radio station can be made at our website on kpppfm.com/donate, and check out our underwriting opportunities at kpppfm.com/underwriting-opportunities on how you can support the first queer radio program in the Red River Valley. Thanks for tuning in. See you next month on the first Wednesday here on Finding Me.